First of all, I just wanted to say I was completely blown away by those papers that I just saw. Those were amazing to me, and I'm going to come back and pick up on a couple of the themes, and in particular from the Flat Time House. If I don't remember to talk about anthropomorphizing buildings, ask the question, and I'll come back and talk about that. And there were a lot of other references to things that I talk about in the book, memory and identity, which I am going to delve into a little bit. So thank you all for those fantastic papers. Let me say also that I feel a little bit like a fraud up here, actually. It sort of dawned on me sometime in the past 24 hours. Okay, so these are all people who run historic sites related to art and creativity, who foster ongoing creative activities in their own sites, and they probably know more about this topic than I do. So what I thought I would try to do is share with you some of the things that I've discovered in writing this book. And really I'm thinking of it as intimations of this relationship between creativity and old places. That I am not necessarily going to provide you with answers about this relationship, but hopefully will give you some clues to ponder and think about the deep relationship between creativity and old places. As you know from the introduction, the work I'm going to talk about was the product of my fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. And this is the main building, which was designed by McKim, Mead, and White. It's on the Janiculum Hill in Rome, overlooking the old city. And it is itself an artist home and studio. It was purpose-built as a place of creativity. So you see on the far, on both sides, those pavilions on each side were built as sculptor studios. There are two more in the foreground. And the double height windows were painters' studios originally. The windows above that are typically occupied now by landscape architects because they have the best views of the old city of Rome and the landscape around Rome. So this is a place that was purpose-built to foster creativity, and in particular to foster cross-disciplinary study between these different scholars at the Academy, between artists, writers, historic preservationists like me, architects, classical scholars, poets, fiction writers, and the whole idea is to bring these different disciplines together and nurture the capacity for them to interact with each other and have their work be influenced by those interactions. And I have to say, from my experience, I think it's a process that works. We also benefited from Donna's work there. Only last year at this time, she was at the American Academy, retracing the steps of Daniel Chester French, who was himself a strong supporter of the creation of the American Academy in Rome. So I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to have been there, but I wanted to just highlight the fact that it is itself a place of creativity. I'm going to talk primarily about the relationship between old places and creativity, but I wanted to put it in context. All of you all are associated with places, with artist homes and studios that are old in one way or another, some less old than others. My essay on creativity in old places was part of my work looking at why old places matter to people more generally. The book was originally published as online essays by the National Trust Preservation Forum program, but ultimately the book was issued by Rowman and Littlefield as a part of the American Association for State and Local History series, and it was done with 75 full-color photographs. So I hope you'll give the book a look and think about how it might apply more broadly to your work. Now, why did I set out to explore this topic? For many years, I taught historic preservation law at the University of Maryland, and I discovered that people really didn't have the words and phrases to describe why the old places in our communities and in our lives seem to matter so much to them. People would talk about preserving our heritage and property values and tourism, but these didn't seem to capture the really deeply felt passion that people felt about these places. So I began to gather these reasons together and to think about them, and my idea was to give people the words and phrases to express why old places mattered to them, and hopefully to build a stronger ethic of historic preservation in their communities and in the country. I wanted people to think about it for themselves and then express what they thought mattered. Let me say at the outset that I don't think there is a set number of reasons that old places matter to people. I think there are as many reasons as there are places and the relationship between places and people. For any one person, certain things may resonate and others may not. But what I really hope as I go through this presentation is for you to be thinking about why old places matter to you and to the people who built or lived in your site, and which of these may resonate with visitors to your site. And I hope that you'll raise questions and that we can have a conversation at the end of the presentation. Ultimately, I wrote about 14 reasons, and I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but I want you to understand the overall context of the book. The 14 reasons include a wide range from what I consider the most fundamental ideas of continuity, identity, and belonging and memory, to the fact that old places inspire us with awe through beauty and sacredness, and because they tell us about history, ancestry, and learning, and because they foster healthy, sustainable, and economically vibrant communities. For you, the representatives of the historic artist homes and studios, I'd like to focus on themes that I think are most relevant to you as the stewards of these places that were both places of identity for the artist who created or recreated them, and places of beauty and creativity. I'd like to begin by reading an excerpt from the HAHS website. For visual artists, it all comes together in the studio, the place where the work of inspiration catches fire. For most artists, the studio is more than one room set aside for work. The studio is the whole environment where creativity is nurtured. This environment includes homes, gardens, and all the places where family and friends gather and interact. The homes and studios of artists were catalysts for creativity. And then it goes on to highlight a few of the things, the tangible things that people experience. Then there are the fleeting impressions, light falling on an easel, a passing rainstorm, the scent of turpentine on wet plaster. Why is it important to save these places, these homes and studios where artists worked and created? It's not so much, in my mind, for the history of the artist, him or herself, but it's for what people can learn from these places today. How are people inspired by the site to be creative themselves? How are they given the opportunity to understand themselves and humanity more deeply? It's not for the people today that we save these places. It's for the people today that we save these places, not because of a simple notion about preserving the past. These places of creativity draw other people who want to connect with the power of creativity. Just as people once traveled on pilgrimages to village the relics of saints, they now go to visit the places where creative people worked, dreamt, and struggled. From Donald Judd's loft building in Manhattan to William Faulkner's Roanoke, these places attract people who want to connect with the creative power of art and artists. Now, I'm not only going to focus on the visual arts, but also I want to talk about music and writing and places that inspire people to write music and to write poetry and fiction, because I think those are very analogous to the work that you do. I usually begin the discussion of creativity in old places by reminding people that there has always been a relationship between historic preservation and creative people. Many of the people who started the preservation movement in America were artists and writers, such as people from the Charleston Renaissance, who were key to the beginning of the preservation movement in Charleston and thus also in America. Just think of the importance of place in Porgy and Bess. The place is often the subject matter of painting or a character in itself in writing or music. And that's why creative people felt compelled to try to save these places. We find this overlap throughout the country, and artist colonies are often historic places that have become tourist attractions, like Carmel, Provincetown, Ogunquit, Greenwich Village, and Saugatuck, shown here. And increasingly, to many people's surprise, places like Detroit. All were places that creative people were drawn to because they were distinctive and interesting, and at one time cheap, and because other creative people were there. Again, many of the leaders of the early preservation movement were committed to saving these places that inspired them, the quaint, the beautiful, the familiar, and the strange. I'd like to begin with three of the themes that are generally applicable to the idea of why old places matter, but that I think help explain why the artists who built or lived in the places that you all steward were so connected to their homes and studios, but also why visitors and residents, for those of you who have artist residencies, become attached to the artist homes and studios. These themes may simply help you to reinforce why these places matter to both the artist and the visitor. And let me begin with one of the words that I heard most often as I interviewed people: continuity. Old places give people a sense of continuity. In a world that is constantly changing, old places provide people with a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. Maria Lewicka, an environmental psychologist, says that the majority of authors agree that the development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and that it helps to overcome identity crises and gives people the sense of stability that they need in the ever-changing world. We often see this in the places in our communities. In the upper right is Cullo Station School in my hometown, where my father went to school, which continues as a preschool today. It provides a sense of continuity between the generations. We see this perhaps most forcefully when the continuity between place and people is broken. On the left is Palmer Chapel in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where people were forcibly removed in the 30s to create the park. And yet, even generations later, people come back to that chapel for reunions to reinforce the connection with the place. When this continuity is broken, it has a profound impact on people that is long-lasting, often for generations. Many of you are undoubtedly fully aware of how deeply connected your artists were to their homes and studios, but you may not be aware that there's science around the way that people become attached to place. For artists, I've often noted that they seem to need the stability of place to do their work, and visitors and residents from residencies also become attached to the place, and this is demonstrated through the entire field of place attachment. Memory. And I heard a number of you all mention memory today. Old places help us remember. The architect May Donadei tells her granddaughter, old buildings are like memories you can touch. Memory is an essential part of consciousness. Without memory, we're hardly ourselves. And we've all seen this in how we react to people who have Alzheimer's or other conditions where they lose their memory. Their identity is partially erased. And there is, as the geographers Stephen Holscher and Derek Alderman say, an inextricable link between memory and place. People anchor their divergent memories in place. There are two aspects to memory. There's individual memory, and here I use the example of the Cafe Reggio in New York, where I spent a lot of time in my 20s, and which I still go back to measure how I've changed since then. And then there's a sense of collective memory, like the memory of the March on Washington and the reflecting pool. Even people who were certainly not there still have a sense of collective memory when they see images from this place. There are also, as many of you as stewards of artist homes know, aspects of memory that may be embedded in the place that people may not yet know. And here I use this example of this cemetery gate from the cemetery in North Carolina where I will eventually be buried. And you may notice that there's a gate there, but there's no wall. And that's because the elders of the church saw fit to sell the stone of the wall to the highway department for the construction of a road, a terrible mistake. And yet, the fact that that gate remains continues that memory even when people may have forgotten it. When I was living in Rome, I went to the Venice Biennale, and I was thinking I was just going there really to enjoy going. But it had the theme of the memory palace. And for millennia, people have recognized this link between memory and place, that if we placed our memories in a house with rooms, things were easier to remember. At the Biennale, I was struck by how many artists in the exhibit were focused on issues of place, identity, and memory, from the Chinese artist reusing parts of destroyed historic temples, to filmmakers looking at new places and highlighting the sense of alienation and disorientation that new places seem to embody. This connection between memory and place is both deeply satisfying to those experiencing it and potentially inspirational, the way that artists at the Venice Biennale were inspired by memory of place or sought to highlight the connection. Individual identity. Old places embody our identity, and people have long recognized this connection between place and identity, from Cicero, who wrote of revisiting his grandfather's house, to James Marston Fitch, who wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizens to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. Psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and architectural theorists all study the relationship between place and identity, and most would agree that place is inextricably linked with the development and maintenance of the continuity of self. There are even people who say that identity and place are inseparable, that people are always in and of place, that life itself begins and ends with place. Our sense of identity is not static, however. It changes over time, and we form identities with different places. And here I show the church where I was raised and my great-grandfather's house, which are places of identity from my early life, but also DuPont Circle and ultimately the American Academy in Rome. People's identities and their association with place change over time. And to my surprise, I discovered that places didn't even have to be particularly old for people to begin to be attached to them. You see this image of Eastland Mall down in the lower center. This is the mall of my junior high school years. When I was writing this essay, I was at the Academy writing this essay on identity, and my cousin sent me images of Eastland Mall that was being documented before it was demolished. And I discovered to my surprise that a preservation group had sprung up to try to save Eastland Mall, which astonished me. And they were using the same sort of language that I was using in writing about the relationship with old places. Identity, memory. That Eastland, in fact, represented the identity of the east side of Charlotte, North Carolina, which is probably more true than it should be. But what this made me realize is that it takes about 30 or 40 years for people to become attached to a place. So for those of you who have artist homes and studios that are about that age, or are even younger than that, recognize that people will become attached to those places in a relatively short period of time. This, of course, also coincides with the period of time when places are most vulnerable. Eastland Mall was considered ugly and outdated at this moment in time. It's when old places are most likely to be lost. And yet, people had already formed attachments with them. There is a corollary to this, and that is that if people cease using a place, their attachment can wither. I've heard in all the presentations that I've seen here today, your efforts to keep visitors engaged and actively coming back to the place. That's critically important for visitors to continue to form attachment with your place. Think of how your artists had their identity shaped by the homes and studios where they were. Look at the Wharton Eschricht House and how it seems to express the artist identity. The George O'Keeffe home in Abiquiu and how it expresses the identity of George O'Keeffe. Note also that many of these places were not built new, but were old places that were reinvented and reinterpreted by the artist, who were often themselves inspired by the sense of time represented by an older place, like the Gary Melcher's studio. Old places embody our identity. Beauty. Old places are beautiful. If you Google beautiful places, you get a whole lot of natural places, you get a whole lot of old places, and only a smattering of new places. Beauty and the threat to beautiful places was the driving force for many early preservation efforts, and beauty remains at the heart of why people care about old places. We all know how much harder it is to save an ugly building than it is to save a beautiful building. Yet as I talk to people about beauty as a reason for old places mattering to people, I found that people were reticent to talk about it. In particular, the artists at the American Academy were hesitant. In fact, if someone said their work was beautiful, they took it as an insult. Yet at least one, the photographer Catherine Wagner, said that she uses beauty as a strategy to lure people into her photographs, and then she sticks in the knife when they realize what they're actually looking at. So beauty can be a strategy, and yet people become uncomfortable talking about it. You all are also in the beauty business because many people come to your sites to be inspired by beauty. The uncomfortableness is for many reasons: the subjective nature of beauty, the difficulty of defining it, the loaded cultural aspects of beauty, or the fact that it may simply be considered frivolous or expendable. Yet beauty is still something that delights, moves, and satisfies people. A study by the British Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment found that beauty is a deeply positive experience, contributing to happiness and well-being. So, what exactly is this relationship between beauty and old places? And what difference does beauty make in people's lives? Old places may be beautiful for their design, but sometimes they're beautiful because of their very age, because of the mark that time has left upon them. Ruins have been the exemplars of the concept of the sublime for hundreds of years, epitomized by the famous Gothic ruins of Tintern Abbey on the River Wye in Wales, or here, the ruins of Windsor, monumental Corinthian columns that are all that remain of a vanished plantation house in Mississippi. These places epitomize the palpable sense of time and loss. I'm not going to be able to define beauty for you all here today, but as I read and talked to people about beauty, a few words and phrases captured the experiences I've had and that I believe other people also have at beautiful old places. Delight, exhilarating surprise, speechlessness, the language of timeless reality, echo of an ideal, sudden, unexpected harmony of the body, mind, and world. Altogether, it's what the architect Katie Newell, a fellow at the Academy, described to me as that moment of gasp, a moment when we are stopped in our tracks and taken out of ourselves, when we feel that the universe is a big and amazing place and that we are part of it. That may be as close to my own subjective idea of a moment of beauty as I can get. The idea of beauty raises seemingly endless philosophical questions. Reviewing the many attempts to define beauty over the course of human civilization is a fascinating journey through history and art. Yet regardless of how beauty is defined, people perceive and desire beauty in their lives and in their communities, and they find beauty in old places, including specifically artist homes and studios, where they can be moved and changed by the experience of seeing through the artist's eyes. I'm thinking of the many vignettes at Abiquiu, the arrangement of stones and skulls, or the plaster hands hanging in the studio at Chesterwood. There are studies that show that people's brain chemistry is even changed by the experience of beauty. I'll end the discussion of beauty with one more thought. As some of you know, I recently wrote an essay about why Notre Dame matters, highlighting the way it is a part of our individual memories, a part of the national identity of France, and a part of our universal identity, reminding us all of our shared humanity. I'll also note that this is a place that has inspired artists, writers, and musicians for centuries. One of the very thoughtful comments on the National Trust Facebook page in response to the essay described how torn the commenter felt about all the funding that materialized almost instantly in the context of a world where homelessness, a lack of medical care, a lack of food security, and refugee crises and conflict are common. I responded that I didn't think it was an either-or choice, that I also supported housing security, universal health care, and food security. Yet I also emphasized the way this old place seemed to bring people together so that we could sense our shared humanity. I suggested a book called On Beauty and Being Just by Elaine Scarry, which suggested the experience of beauty has the capacity to help people be more empathetic and to open their hearts to all of humanity. I think the old places that you all steward also have that capacity, and I encourage you to embrace the beauty of your sites and let the visitor experience the profound impact of beauty. Creativity. Old places spur creativity. People are inspired by old places to compose, write, and do other creative work. In talking about creativity, I'll note first the very practical aspects of creativity and spurring creativity. Richard Florida, in his studies and writings on the rise of the creative class, noted that the creative class is drawn to certain types of places, and he's tried to identify the qualities of places that are attractive to creative people. Florida didn't identify why, but he said this, that authenticity, as in real buildings, real people, real history, is key. And this relationship is borne out by studies. The National Trust Research and Policy Lab has, in the report Older, Smaller, Better, demonstrated the power of older, smaller buildings in spurring startups and other economic and social activity. This study essentially proves that the contrarian New York planner Jane Jacobs was right. Communities do indeed need smaller, older buildings in order to thrive. And as the American economy increasingly turns to creative work, this may be an increasingly important reason to keep and reuse old places and to find sources of support for artist homes and studios. This connection between old places and the creative economy is increasingly acknowledged. Here's a statement from the website for Creative Many, a Michigan nonprofit. Michigan's resurgence depends on a commitment to invest in the unique assets that make it competitive. Increasing the state's investment in the creative community would result in a growth in jobs, private investment in the arts, and audience participation, all generating dollars to the state that would contribute beyond the initial investment. Whether in a major city or rural town, creating the places people want to live often begins with the creative industry, including walkable communities, vibrant cultural downtowns, green conscious initiatives, competitive education, and entrepreneurial innovation. I heard a woman named Amy Bragg from Preservation Detroit capture it in this sentence: historic preservation is the original creative placemaking. But I'd like to talk for a bit about exactly how old places inspire people creatively. I was privileged a few years ago, thanks to Donna's invitation, to facilitate a discussion on creativity in old places with Judith Shea, who had been a sculptor in residence at Chesterwood, and Eric Nathan, a contemporary composer whose work, commissioned for the Boston Symphony Players, was titled Why Old Places Matter, I'm happy to say. Eric was primarily inspired to write about why old places matter by a 4th century church in Rome called Santa Sabina. And here's what he had to say about how the old place inspired him. I was immediately captured by the enveloping sense of tranquility, solitude, and sheer beauty that fills its dark, cavernous space, which was in such contrast to the brilliantly bright Roman light that shines atop the Aventine Hill, and also the bustle of the city that surrounds the hill. The windows are made of translucent stone, and they transform the bright Roman light into glowing hues. It was magical to watch this warm light dance upon the walls. Eric was asked how people might be inspired by an old place. He said, I try to allow myself to be open to the unique sensory experience of each place, to let the place envelop me in its atmosphere and history. I would recommend to others to be open and keep listening to the space and your memories of a place. It may not be the place itself that directly inspires you. It may be how the place asks you to see yourself differently. I would encourage you to listen to particularly the second movement of Eric's work, Why Old Places Matter, which captures the way he thinks this old place sounds, and you can hear in it echoes of history and of time. We hear this in other places. This is RCA Studio A in Nashville, which was recently saved by through the efforts of the musician Ben Folds, intentionally because it seems to transmit artistic legacies, exactly the sort of thing that you all are trying to do in your work at artist homes and studios. At our National Trust Historic Sites, we're trying to continue to foster creativity. You could consider Philip Johnson's Glass House another artist home and studio. It was the place where he experimented with architecture, and it was a place that inspired him. The Trust has continued that tradition, and this is an installation called Veil by Fuyiko Nakaya. And here's an installation at the pavilion at the Glass House by the internationally famous artist Yayoi Kusama of her work Narcissus Garden that she originally did at the Venice Biennale. She also covered the Glass House in her signature polka dots, changing the way people perceive that space. And of course, at Chesterwood, as you saw yesterday, we've continued to host contemporary sculptors in residence and a contemporary outdoor sculpture show now for decades. So, do we know why old places foster creativity? I don't think there's a single answer to that. But in one of the only studies I'm aware of that seeks to isolate the difference that the age of place makes on people's perception of place, and this was a study by a guy named Jeremy Wells, who's now at the University of Maryland. He compared this new urbanist development outside of Charleston, South Carolina, called Ion, and here are images from Ion, to downtown Charleston, to south of Broad, the old place. And he tried to figure out through studies how people perceive these two places differently. And here's one of the things that he found that surprised him. People's spontaneous fantasy lives were spurred more in the old place than in the new place. Something about the old place made them imagine past lives and think about that in a way that spurred their imaginations. So one of the key differences between the new and the old seems to be that the old has the capacity to spur our imaginations. Interestingly, there are now many people studying this relationship between people and place and looking for the difference that age makes. Juhani Palasma, the Finnish architectural theorist, said in a recent article he wrote for the National Trust, "Why do we enjoy being in old settings, such as the historic towns of Europe? Isn't it because these environments, with their rich historical layers, tell us epic narratives of human culture and of the desire for order and beauty? Natural erosion and traces of use by people humanize buildings and built landscapes by making their epic story of time palpable." I thought I would share a bit of information with you about new research about the neuroscience behind the experience of place, phenomenology, and architecture. Harry Mulgrave, who wrote The Architect's Brain, Neuroscience, Creativity, and Architecture, wrote, "It is no exaggeration to say that we have learned more about our biological selves in the past half-century than in all of human history. And as a result of these developments in the humanities, sociology, philosophy, psychology, and human paleontology, in particular, have been forced to restructure their premises and research agendas radically." This type of information is just coming to the fore in historic preservation and in how we experience older places. This is President Lincoln's cottage in Washington, D.C., which is a National Trust historic site. And they have just engaged in a study of the visitor experience from a scientific perspective. They've concluded that the experience for many visitors is like a religious experience, with a sense of awe and the opening up of a sense of empathy. The second phase of the study, which is planned but has not yet taken place, intends to use mobile EEG technology to literally measure how people's brains are firing as they go through the tour experience and as they go through the house. There's a rush of additional information about how people experience place. I'd like to quote Robert Lamb Hart of Hart-Howerton, who's the author of A New Look at Humanism in Architecture, Landscapes, and Urban Design, who noted that there's a whole new world of cascading information from a range of sciences exploring how people experience architecture and place. A few years ago, the British National Trust released a research report using some of the neuroscience techniques, titled Places That Make Us. The report, which is available online, sought to understand the, quote, visceral but intangible feeling people have in places that are special to them, as well as the depth of people's connection with place. Stating that was the first piece of research of its kind, the project used functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to track changes to areas of the brain associated with emotional processing as people looked at images of places and objects. They examined activity in 3 brain regions: the left amygdala, which is associated with our automatic unconscious processing of emotion; the medial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with emotional appraisal and memory processing; and the parahippocampal place area, which is associated with responses to place. The report concluded that, and I'm quoting here, "It is clear that key areas of emotional processing are activated by special places. Firstly, we have seen evidence that the amygdala generates an automatic emotional response to these places. Moreover, we have shown that our feelings are made conscious through the medial prefrontal cortex by accessing memories of the places and appraising the situation associated with that place. Finally, even non-emotional processing areas appear to play an important role, eliciting thoughts about oneself being in the place." The report concluded that, again I quote, "The findings of this research show that places are more than a space to visit and enjoy for their aesthetic beauty. In fact, they have long-lasting effects that have an impact on us physically and psychologically, and even encourage behavioral responses that have the potential to benefit others." While this study did not distinguish between natural places and historic places. Both were incorporated into the study. And while very few studies have been done that focus exclusively on how humans perceive older and historic places, there are a few key ideas that seem to surface relating to historic preservation that seem to confirm many of the things that preservationists have known from observation or intuition for many years. Consider, if you will, the way your visitors experience the place. Just as the artists who created these places were inspired and changed by the place, so visitors to these sites may be today. Thank you for the work that you do to save these places and make them available as places of inspiration, awe, beauty, creativity, and change. Keep inspiring people through these places of creativity, and thank you.
You know, cities subsidize football stadiums, and there's breaks, real estate breaks for historic investment properties. Is it inconceivable that there could be a carve-out that would benefit shrines to art and culture?
Well, I would love to see that. Jim previewed that question for me last night on the piazza. So, you know, I don't think that the United States funds artistic endeavors as much as it should, including the preservation of places like historic artist homes and studios. But I don't need to delve into the political realities that we live in. So I support the concept. I can't say how realistic it is at the federal level. I do find that states are better at funding creative things than the federal government is. Other questions? I wanted to come back to the flat time house too and say there's also this whole new body of work that's coming out about how people perceive buildings, and a lot of it supports the notion that they do literally anthropomorphize the buildings immediately, and that people, when they scan for a facade, they're looking for something that looks like a face. So the scholars in that area are Justin Hollander and Ann Sussman and a number of others, but they're doing it by measuring eye tracking movements and what the eye looks at when it perceives place. And there was a question back here, I think. Someone else? Yes.
I was just thinking that sometimes people have bad memories of places.
Yes.
And I know in our case, trying to save a national engineering landmark that was on the Moscow power plant could get no traction whatsoever, because people's memories of it was in the smoke being spurting out and marring the landscape or whatever. You know, it had major significance historically. And then opposite to that, there are things that are saved based on untruth. You know, the thing that they're remembering, the thing that they think is important about a place isn't even true.
Yes.
And yet that will get huge traction. So it's just a weird observation I wanted to make.
Sure. Well, first, on difficult places, I heard someone earlier today refer to the Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which of course intentionally tries to preserve difficult places to keep that memory alive and to ensure that people continue to process those memories. And I am a proponent for, as much as possible, keeping difficult places, because I think it fosters that conversation and discussion. You're also talking about some other thought in there. Well, they'll come back to me. Sorry, lost that one. Yes.
I just wanted to add in case American-based organisations don't know this research, that it's also, and it's available on websites, Heritage Lottery Fund in Britain and also Arts Council have done reports on the importance of heritage for people, you know, proving that it's important heritage is important to us for our well-being and community and so on. And also Arts Council about the importance of arts in people's lives. They've done studies on how important it is. So these things can help with our funding and talking activities, things like that.
Great, thank you for sharing that. England and Great Britain is definitely at the forefront of doing some of this research and really sharing it widely to help support things. There's some great, interesting studies coming out too, also about how the handling of historic objects helps elderly patients and people with Alzheimer's, and that it has profound benefits to have that memory be conjured by those objects. Another question? Well, thank you all. I hope I was able to give you a few intimations of this relationship, and it's been a real honor to be with you all. I love the work you do and love visiting your site, so thank you and keep it up.